This is A Guide to Grammar and Grammatical Usage, Chapter 5, Errors in English. Okay, so this is one of those necessary evil kind of lectures. So the chapter argues that grammar isn't boring, it's a means to an end. For this class, understanding grammar rules is essential to constructing your paper. But as far as grammar rules, they are kind of boring. But what the chapter is trying to argue is that when you have a better understanding of grammar rules, you'll be empowered to use that information to make your writing less laborious and annoying. So first off, grammar describes, it does not prescribe. So it's not about telling you what not to do. It's really about understanding how our language works. And we'll talk about how it changes as well, right? So the primary purpose of grammar is to describe change and development. Grammar seems like some external fixed thing, but it is as in flux as language itself, which grows and transforms over time. Just think about an old movie you've seen. Would their grammar rules be the same as ours? Or I'm sure you've had read something in school that was Old English, like Shakespeare, and you encounter a lot of thous and words and phrases that seem alien to us today. Language, like other things in the culture, is a reflection of the current socio-cultural political time period. That means that they change, and we need to adapt to that when we're writing our paper, so our papers don't sound old, dusty, or out of place in the current context. So sometimes this comes up with sociological concepts that change in terminology over time. So using an outdated one may confuse readers or connect back to past understandings. For instance, using the term battered woman is not often used unless in really specific contexts nowadays. It evolved into the term domestic violence as the kind of accepted terminology. But in recent years, this has further refined to terms like dating violence or intimate partner violence. So if you're using battered woman, it sounds old and out of place and not appropriate to the modern era, which is why the literature review is so important. To keep us up to date on modern research, we have to think about our wording because words have meanings and a power to them. So we need to be careful how we use them. So grammar's worth studying. As it says in the chapter, grammar helps us to express our ideas clearly and effectively in both speech and writing. We want our writing to be effective and communicate to others what we're really trying to say. So when our grammar is poor, it causes interruptions to the reader, and it breaks up the flow and makes the paper less readable. So grammar is concerned with the structure of language, to understand the ways that words function linguistically. The syntax, as it's called, the rules for constructing full sentences out of words and phrases. So every language has a different set of syntactic rules, but all languages have some type of syntax. And again, the usage is constantly changing. As the language changes and evolves, as our meanings and values, or to some extent our social roles, evolve in the culture, this affects the evolution of language from one time period to the next. So it makes sense to review these things because things might have changed since you were in elementary school, which is when we learn most of the information about language and grammar. So another thing they talked about in the chapter was to stop worrying about the rules. The biggest mistake that leads to writer's block is worrying about the grammar or trying to write the perfect sentence top to bottom. Remember, that's fighting how your brain works. You need to use proper grammar, but that's something that comes with editing your paper, as it's nearly impossible to write the perfect sentence top to bottom, intro to conclusion, right? It's just not that simple. This doesn't mean that you just write things as casually as possible. You still use that knowledge you've acquired after years of education, as you know more about grammar than you realize. Just as a result of speaking and writing, over time, you learn a lot. It's when we revise, which we'll talk a lot about later, you can really focus on grammar or using appropriate grammar when revising, but it's important to understand a review. Also, attitudes about usage have become far less rigid in recent years. Weird internet words have become normal to us, and we incorporate these new words into our understandings. Each year, new words are put into the dictionary, as old ones are taken around the barn and shot to make room for more new words. For instance, in 2020, the words friggin', climate emergency, or my favorite, awesome sauce, all one word, are now technically words in the dictionary. So language is fluid and it changes. Kellyanne Conway did this in a terrible way when she birthed the term alternative facts, became part of the cultural lexicon. Obviously in the worst way, as she's a terrible person who's paid to lie terribly for a living. But you get what I mean. Not only do terms arise, but a general relaxation of previous rules is more normative as time progresses. And we all say things like, I can't even, right? So for your paper, you may use the term I, which I understand is discouraged in a lot of research papers. But for this one, I ask that you explain your positionality in some ways that other disciplines would not ask. And I should mention that while using contractions like don't are common in speech, they're not acceptable in academic sociological research papers, unless it's, a particular person's interview quote or something of that nature. So that's something to look out for as you draft and revise your paper. It's an easy fix to go through and change some of the don'ts to do nots, right? But some of these rules are more strict and some of them are kind of being relaxed over time. So it's important to kind of understand the fluid nature of these changes. Okay, so moving on to basic grammatical terms. So looking at parts of speech, grammar groups words together that have similar functions in our language. Some words fall into multiple categories: nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, conjunctions, prepositions, interjections. These are all different parts of speech. So a noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. A pronoun is a substitute for a noun. A verb expresses action, a state of being, or a condition. It says or asserts something. An adjective modifies, affects the meaning of a noun or pronoun. An adverb modifies or affects the meaning of a verb, adjective, or another adverb. A conjunction connects words or groups of words together. A preposition shows relationship between the noun or pronoun it precedes and some other word. And an interjection independently expresses feeling. So we'll go over some of those parts of speech a little bit more in depth in a second, but the chapter also talks about learning to distinguish between verbs and verbals. So what's the difference between the two? A verb is a word used to describe an action, state, or occurrence, and forming the main part of a predicate of a sentence. A verbal is a word or words that function as a verb. So for example, she slept in. Slept functions as the verb because she is performing the action. Jogging 3 miles every day is good for you. To jog is a verb, but in this case, jogging is used as a verbal. Another thing that needs to be kind of reviewed is to identify phrases. So a phrase is a group or pairing of words in English. A phrase can be long or short, but it does not include the subject-verb pairing necessary to make a clause. So when you identify clauses, in its simplest form, a clause in grammar is a subject plus a verb. The subject is the entity doing the action of the sentence, and the verb is the action that the subject completes. A clause creates a complete thought, right? An idea or statement that can stand alone. So complete thought is also called a main clause or independent clause. Okay, moving on to agreement and case. Okay, so agreement. This is where we often read a passage and think it sounds wrong. Often it's because there's an agreement issue, such as how singular verbs require singular nouns. So a predicate usually agrees with the subject in person and numbers, meaning if you're talking about one person, you don't use a plural or switch genders in the sentence. There's a lot of examples of these covered specifically in the chapter. Also, when it comes to agreement of pronoun and antecedent, similar agreement issues as above, with an agreement being in person, gender, or number. A case is just the form of a noun or pronoun that it takes when it's establishing its relationship to other words in a sentence. So to differentiate, a nominative case is an indication of the person doing an action, when an objective case is when it indicates the person or thing that's acted upon. So there's some tricky ways these two are not exclusive, which they get into with a bunch of specific examples in the chapter. Okay, moving on to verbs. So principal parts of verbs. This is that present tense, past participle. So verbs have different tenses to express time. The tense of the verb walk in the sentence, they walk very fast, expresses action in the present. For another example, take the sentence, they walk too far from home. The tense of the verb in this sentence shows that the action happened in the past. In the sentence, they will walk home from school, the verb walk expresses action in the future. These forms of verbs are known as tenses. A verb's tense shows the time of the action or state of being that's being described. To use the tenses of a verb correctly, you must know the principal parts of the verb. A verb has 4 principal parts: the present, present participle, past, and past participle. The first principal part, called the present, is the form of the verb that's listed in the dictionary. The present participle and past participle must be combined with helping verbs before they can be used as verbs in sentences. So the result will always be a verb phrase. Okay, so what the hell am I talking about? Let's use some examples to make this make sense. So let's say in the present tense, right? He walks towards us in a hurry. Versus the present participle is June is walking to the park, right? So the is walking. For past, an example could be they walked to the park, while past participle would be we have walked 3 miles in the last hour. So as I stated before, both the present participle and past participle need helping verbs before they can be used as verbs in sentences. So also in the chapter, there's a list of 50 troublesome verbs that cause common grammar mistakes. That's definitely worth reviewing on page 48 and 49. Okay, moving to linking and auxiliary verbs. So most verbs describe action, but some instead describe a state of being, not of action. There are also auxiliary verbs that help other verbs to establish a mood or the tense, like has been. So when it comes to tense and tone, tense is the time of the action, past, present, or future, while tone is much more about communicating effective meaning, or basically, for lack of a better term, the vibe, right? It's kind of more the tone. So I'm sure you've read some writing that has a much more academic tone, right? Or a drier tone. Or even like if you're reading, Edgar Allan Poe, it has kind of an eerie tone, right? So the tone is more about how you're communicating your meanings and the kind of, almost feeling that comes with it. And voice is where we see either passive or active voice typically. So passive voice is more common in academic writing, but it's also why it sometimes seems very lifeless. Active voice is much more direct, and it's the approach that I often suggest you try to take for some aspects of your paper. But there are situations where passive voice makes sense, such as talking about a group of people who receive something. But the problem is, in passive voice, especially with sociology, you're often focused more on the result of the action, more so than focusing on the actor or subject of the sentence. So you guys will get to actually practice passive and active voice as one of your weekly writing exercises, so we'll get into that later. But at this point, just understand when I'm revising your paper and saying there's too much passive voice, it just means that oftentimes it's getting wordy, it's getting muddled, and you're focusing too much on the result of the action more so than the person itself, right? So this can be problematic when we're talking about groups of people, especially marginalized communities. If we're focusing more on, let's say this particular group faces this issue, instead of focusing more on the group, it kind of almost dehumanizes that group sometimes. So we'll talk about that much more later. All right, moving into ones that hopefully you're pretty familiar with. Adjectives and adverbs, right? The spice that makes writing extra nice. So adjectives modify pronouns and nouns describing them. Adjectives normally indicate quality, size, shape, duration, feelings, and more. Adjectives usually provide relevant information about the nouns or pronouns that they modify or describe by answering questions like, what kind, how many, which one, how much. So adjectives can enrich your writing by adding precision and really originality to your writing. So I have a couple examples here about how these work a little bit differently. Also, like I always point out, there's some specific guidelines in your chapter about proper use of adjectives and adverbs on page 58 and 59. So an adverb modifies a verb, adjective, or other adverbs by describing or limiting to make meaning more exact. Adverbs usually tell how, when, where, why, how often, and how much. Adverbs are commonly, but not always, distinguished from corresponding adjectives by the suffix ly. right? Like in the example here on the slide, instead of quick, quickly. Certain adverbs are distinguished from corresponding nouns by the suffixes. And certain adverbs are distinguished from corresponding prepositions in not being connected to a following noun. So in the chapter, they kind of get into this more in depth. And again, I know you know all of this because you've had, courses at some point in your educational level, but a lot of this stuff, it's just important to review, right? So an adverb is a word that improves the adjective, the verb, or, whatever it's specifically modifying or relating to. So some examples given here on the visual on the slide, right, kind of talks about how the adverbs function, right? That they describe the where, how, when, how often, and how much. So a conjunction is a word which connects two words or clauses, or sentences, phrases, and shows the relationship between them. They're used to avoid making the text seem like bullet points and to make the text kind of flow together in a reasonable way. So there's different kinds of conjunctions. There's coordinating conjunctions that are used to link or join two words or phrases that are equally important and complete in terms of grammar when compared with each other. So some of the coordinating conjunctions would be for, and, nor, but, or, yet, or soon. Right? Or you could remember that with the acronym fanboys. There's also subordinating conjunctions that are used to join an independent and complete clause with a dependent clause that relies on the main clause for meaning and relevance. So some examples would be although, as, before, once, though, until, whether, right? And I don't have a fun acronym for that one. And correlative conjunctions are pairs of conjunctions used in different sentences to join different words or groups of words in a sentence together. So examples of this would be both and, either or, neither nor, kind of whether or, that kind of fun stuff. So when you want to understand the proper function of conjunctions, first you need to distinguish among the meanings of conjunctions and conjunctive adverbs. So conjunctions, especially those that are used to join clauses, have to be chosen very specifically, right? Because they show logical relationships of ideas. So if you use the word and instead of the word or, it completely changes the context of a sentence, right? It seems so small, something that we use, these kind of conjunctions we use every day, but it can dramatically change the kind of context and the meaning of the relationship between those parts of the sentence. Also, you want to use correlative conjunctions to correlate two ideas. Only two ideas, right? If you're going to use something like or, you can't necessarily, you're trying to make sure that you're using just something that correlates two ideas, right? So if you're saying neither this nor that, then that's going to make sure that you're only talking about two ideas. If you try to keep neither this, nor this, nor this, nor this, nor this, nor this, nor that, it doesn't work, and it changes the relationship that, that kind of gives integrity or meaning to the sentence. You also want to avoid using a conjunctive adverb to join words or phrases or dependent clauses. So they give an example or two in the chapter about how it just kind of confuses the meanings. So for example, if you were saying, my favorite classes are sociology, ethnic studies, and, kinesiology or something like that. It wouldn't make sense to say, my favorite classes are sociology, ethnic studies, also kinesiology, right? It doesn't have the same flow. It confuses the relationship between these things. So again, it seems so small, the difference between and also, but it really does make a difference in effectively communicating your meaning in your paper, right? Another thing to look at is to be careful in using like as a subordinating conjunction. Obviously, sometimes we use the word a bit more than it should be, and oftentimes, if we say something in a more informal way, then like is making its way much more into the lexicon. But in standard English, like is used as a preposition with no verb following it, right? So he looks like an athlete is the example in the chapter. So for clauses of comparison, you use it as or as if in strict formal English, right? So you wouldn't use like instead, right? So instead of saying, my wet shoes felt like they weighed a ton, you'd say, my shoes felt as if they weighed a ton. So again, these are these little nuanced things, these little nuanced rules in English. But this is why I'm making you review this, because you learned all this crap at some point, but it's been a few years, and learning is just repetition. So it's really not about learning it for the first time, but just kind of exploring again your understanding of these things. And this is why I make you read Errors in English, because even though the chapters are very short and succinct, there's so much information in the second half of the book that talks about specific issues and how to address them, right? Or gives you specific examples. So let's say you're having an issue with conjunctions. There's going to be a section that just takes you through how to fix those errors in your paper, right? So later on, when you're getting papers back from me, I'm revising them, the second half of the book can really be a resource to you. But that way, that part isn't assigned, so you don't have to just like memorize every grammar rule in the world. It's really just going to be what specifically applies to your paper and how you need to revise that, right? So sometimes it's just a matter of understanding what the specific grammar rules are for what you're doing, that, you know, maybe it's a run-on sentence, maybe it's, you know, improper use of commas or semicolons or anything like that, any of these grammatical issues. Then there's a section that kind of outlines that. So, you know, you have that as a reference point as you're going through this. But of course, you can also contact me as a reference as well. And also, of course, there's the Writing Center and the Sociology Writing Tutor, who are there to provide that support for you as well when you're going through this, right? I think if you're having any issues with the content from this chapter, I would suggest trying some of the exercises on page 75, right? To see whether or not practicing those things gives you a better sense of, you know, kind of just revision of these grammatical issues. Because I know that these things are very complicated. But again, like they say in the chapter, you know, we know a lot more about it than we think we do, just from the process of living and speaking and writing. But when you're writing a purposeful paper, you want to make sure that you're effectively communicating what you're trying to get across. And the best way to do that is to be very precise with your wording so that you're not giving any sort of ambiguousness or just, you know, kind of so that there isn't any way to interpret those things differently. So that when I'm reading it, when someone else is reading it, we're getting the same sense of what your argument is, right? And a lot of that has to do with the proper use of grammar.